The city was loud that afternoon, the kind of loud that made every sound blur together. Horns, chatter, footsteps, and the metallic hum of trains arriving and leaving the platforms. The train doors slid open with a screech and dozens of tired faces pushed their way in. It was rush hour, and every inch of space seemed to disappear in seconds. Among the crowd was Ethan, a young man with tired eyes but a calm expression. He worked long hours in a small office and took the same train every day. It was a routine he never thought much about, standing near the door holding the cold metal bar, waiting for his stop while the world moved around him in silence. That day, though, something felt different. Maybe it was the heat pressing down from the high sun, or maybe it was the restless noise of people arguing over space. Ethan wiped sweat from his forehead and sighed. He was lucky to have found a seat when he boarded, a small relief in a day full of exhaustion. The train jerked forward. A man near the door grumbled. A child cried somewhere in the back. The smell of perfume, sweat, and dust mixed in the air. Ethan looked out the window, lost in thought. He barely noticed the train stop again until he heard a faint voice, weak, tired, asking softly, "Excuse me, may I?" He turned his head and saw her, a pregnant woman, maybe in her late 20s, holding a small bag and standing near the door. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to balance herself against the moving train. The crowd didn't move. Everyone pretended not to see her. Some stared at their phones. Others looked away completely as if she was invisible. Ethan's heart sank. He looked around. There were plenty of strong men sitting, some even younger than him, but not one of them offered to get up. The woman smiled weakly, clearly uncomfortable but too polite to ask again. Ethan didn't think twice. He stood up, tapping her shoulder gently. "Please take my seat," he said kindly. Her eyes widened, and for a moment she looked as if she might cry. "Oh, thank you," she whispered, her voice almost trembling. Ethan helped her sit down carefully. The train shook again, and she held onto the bar beside her seat with both hands, letting out a small sigh of relief. He smiled and stepped back, holding the railing near the exit. Around them, a few people glanced over. One man nodded approvingly, another looked away, embarrassed. But Ethan didn't care about their reactions. To him it was simple. Someone needed help, and he helped. That was all. The woman looked up at him after a few moments. "Not many people do that anymore," she said softly. Ethan shrugged, smiling faintly. Maybe they just forget how much it matters. Her lips curved into a small smile. "You remind me of someone," she murmured. He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and looked away. But something about her voice, retired yet gentle, stayed with him. The train continued to rattle down the tracks. The sunlight flickered through the windows, flashing across faces and reflections. Ethan noticed that the woman kept glancing at him as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. He wondered if she was okay. At the next stop, the doors opened and more passengers squeezed in. The train grew even more crowded. Ethan was pushed closer to where the woman sat, and he could see the small necklace she wore, a silver heart with tiny initials engraved on it. She held it between her fingers as if it gave her strength. "You should sit," she said suddenly, noticing how he struggled to keep his balance. "You must be tired." Ethan smiled and shook his head. "I'm fine, really. You need it more than I do." She nodded slowly, looking down. For a while, neither of them spoke. The sound of the train filled the silence, the wheels against the tracks, the faint beat before every stop. But Ethan could feel the strange heaviness in the air, as if something important was happening, even though he couldn't explain what. After a few stations, the train began to empty. People got off, others came in, but the woman still sat quietly, her eyes focused on nothing, lost in thought. She looked peaceful but sad at the same time. As the train neared the central station, she suddenly reached into her bag. Ethan watched as she pulled out a small folded note. She looked up at him and said, "You've done something kind today. Don't ever think it's small." He blinked, confused. "It's just a seat," he said. She smiled faintly, shaking her head. "No, it's never just a seat." Before he could ask what she meant, the train slowed to a stop. She stood up slowly, holding on to the railing. Then she handed him the folded note. "You'll understand later," she said, and with that, she stepped out into the crowd. Ethan stood frozen, the note in his hand, as the doors closed behind her. The train started moving again and he looked out the window, watching her figure disappear into the crowd. The noise of the carriage returned, but for Ethan everything else faded away. He looked down at the note, feeling a strange pull in his chest. Something told him that his day, his life even, had just changed in a way he didn't yet understand. As the train rattled toward the next stop, Ethan unfolded the small piece of paper. The handwriting was shaky but clear. It said only one line. "You saved me more than you know." He stared at the words, his mind spinning. He didn't know what they meant, not yet, but deep inside he knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning. The next morning began just like any other. The same gray sky, the same rush of people at the platform, the same train screeching to a halt. But for Ethan, something felt strangely different. He had barely slept the night before. That note from the woman kept replaying in his mind, every word echoing like a mystery he couldn't shake. "You saved me more than you know." He kept asking himself what she meant. Was it just a thank you? Or something deeper? The way she had looked at him, her tired eyes, that small smile, the tremble in her voice, it hadn't felt ordinary. It was as if she had known something he didn't. Ethan stepped into the train again, holding onto the same metal rail he always did. The seat he had given up yesterday was empty now, almost like it was waiting for her. He couldn't help but glance at it, half expecting her to appear again, smiling faintly the way she did. The city passed by outside the window, shops opening, children in uniforms, the usual blur of life. But for Ethan, everything felt quieter. He noticed things he hadn't before, how people avoided eye contact, how they all looked too busy to notice anyone else. He realized how rare that one small act of kindness had been, and how much it had changed his own heart. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the note again. The edges were slightly wrinkled from where he had clutched it all night. "You saved me more than you know." The words still gave him chills. What had he saved her from? He thought about her face, calm but filled with something like sorrow. Maybe she was in trouble. Maybe she was sick. Maybe she needed help and didn't know how to ask. His curiosity was growing stronger than his fear of sounding foolish. He looked closely at the bottom of the note this time, and noticed something faintly written, almost hidden. A line of small letters. Willow Street, number 42. Ethan's heart skipped. It was an address. He hadn't noticed it before. He felt his chest tighten. Should he go there? What if it was a mistake? But the thought wouldn't leave him. The woman had clearly meant for him to see it. The train rattled forward, the sound echoing through the metal floor. Around him, people scrolled through their phones, their faces empty and tired. But Ethan was somewhere else, caught between confusion and a pull he couldn't explain. That evening, as the sun sank behind the buildings, painting the sky with streaks of orange, he walked home slower than usual. He kept replaying every detail, her soft voice, her trembling hands, the way she'd said, "You remind me of someone." It was haunting. He made tea, sat by his small table, and stared at the note again under the yellow kitchen light. He traced the handwriting with his finger. It was delicate, shaky, almost like someone who had written it in pain. "You saved me more than you know." He whispered it aloud, the words sounding heavier this time. "Saved you from what?" he muttered. He didn't have answers, but he knew he wouldn't rest until he found out. The address burned in his mind like a quiet flame. Willow Street, number 42. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the woman's face again, pale, tired, but peaceful. He remembered how she'd clutched her small silver heart necklace when she thanked him. Maybe that was a clue, too. Maybe there was something more behind her sadness. Outside his window, the city lights flickered like restless thoughts. The streets below were empty, but his mind was loud. He knew that tomorrow he'd have to go to Willow Street. Even if it was strange. Even if it made no sense. Something deep inside him told him this wasn't about curiosity anymore. It was about purpose. The next morning he dressed quietly, folded the note again and slipped it into his wallet. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. His co-workers would laugh if he did. They'd call him sentimental, too trusting, too soft-hearted. But Ethan didn't care. He took the early train, the same one where everything had begun. The same rattling floor, the same noise of strangers pretending not to exist. As he stood there, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window, and for the first time he realized something. The woman might have needed help that day, but she had also changed him. In her silence, she'd reminded him that kindness wasn't weakness. That compassion was rare, and when you gave it freely, it could echo far beyond what you imagined. When the train reached his stop, Ethan stepped off, the wind brushing his face. He looked at the small paper in his hand one more time before tucking it safely away. Willow Street, number 42. He didn't know what he would find there, but somehow deep inside, he knew whatever awaited him would answer the mystery behind that haunting sentence. You saved me more than you know. And so, with quiet determination, Ethan took his first step toward Willow Street, unaware that his simple act of kindness had already set a chain of events in motion that would change his life forever. Ethan stood at the corner of Willow Street, staring at the small piece of paper in his hand. The address was written faintly, the ink smudged, but the words were still clear enough to read. No 42 Willow Street. He looked up and saw a quiet lane lined with old houses and overgrown gardens. It didn't look like the kind of place where something dramatic would happen. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. He hesitated. Part of him wanted to turn back, to forget the whole thing and tell himself it was just a random note from a stranger. But another part, stronger, deeper, told him that he had to know. The woman's words had followed him for days, haunting him in ways he couldn't explain. Finally, he started walking. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of rain and blooming jasmine. His shoes crunched softly against the gravel as he passed old mailboxes and faded doors. When he reached number 42, his breath caught for a second. The house was small but well kept, with white paint peeling from the edges and a small wind chime hanging near the porch. The gate was open. He knocked gently. For a few seconds there was no answer. Then footsteps, slow, careful, approached from inside. The door opened, revealing an older woman with silver hair and kind, tired eyes. She looked at him closely, almost as if she recognized him. "You must be Ethan," she said softly. He blinked, surprised. "Yep, how do you know my name?" The woman smiled faintly, though her eyes shimmered with sadness. "She told me about you," she said. "Please come in." Inside, the air was warm but heavy. The faint smell of tea and flowers mixed with something deeper, something sorrowful. On the walls hung pictures of the pregnant woman from the train, smiling, radiant, full of life. Ethan stopped, his chest tightening as realization began to set in. The older woman noticed his gaze and spoke quietly. "That's my daughter," she said. Her name was Clara. "Was?" Ethan asked softly. The woman nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "She passed away the night you met her." The words hit Ethan like a punch. His throat closed up. What?" he stammered. "No, that's not possible. I just saw her. She was alive, she was fine." The older woman placed a trembling hand on his arm. "She wasn't fine, dear," she said gently. She had been unwell for days. The doctors warned her not to travel alone, but she insisted on taking that train. She said she had something important to do. Ethan felt dizzy. He sat down slowly on the couch, his hands shaking. She gave me a note," he whispered. "She said I saved her." I didn't understand what she meant. The old woman nodded, her face filled with sorrow but also a strange peace. "She told me about you," she said. Before she left, she said, "If kindness still exists in the world, I want to see it one more time before my child is born." Ethan stared at her, speechless. The words echoed in his mind like thunder. He remembered Clara's tired eyes, her small smile, the way she had said, "You remind me of someone." "She told me she met a kind young man on the train," the mother continued. "Someone who didn't look away, someone who gave up his seat when everyone else stayed still." She said it gave her hope. Hope that good people still exist. Tears filled Ethan's eyes. He had no words. The room felt smaller, warmer, quieter. The older woman stood and walked to a small wooden drawer. She returned with a folded envelope. "She left this for you," she said, placing it gently in his hands. "She said if you ever came here, I should give it to you." Ethan's fingers shook as he opened it. Inside was another note written in the same delicate handwriting as before. It said, "Ethan, you didn't just give me a seat. You gave me peace. For the first time in months, I believed in kindness again. If I don't make it, please know you helped me remember what humanity feels like. My mother will need strength." You gave me some. Now give her yours. Tears slid silently down Ethan's cheeks. He didn't realize he was crying until the paper blurred before his eyes. The older woman placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. You see, she whispered, sometimes we never know the weight of our actions. But they change lives, and even when we don't mean to. Ethan nodded slowly, unable to speak. The heaviness in his chest wasn't just grief, it was awe. He had done something he thought was small, something simple, and it had become the last kind memory in someone's life. He sat there for a long time, staring at the note, the photos, and the flickering candle by the window. The world outside kept moving, cars passing, children laughing, but inside that small house, time stood still. Before he left, the older woman walked him to the door. Clara's baby survived, she said softly. A girl, we named her Hope. Ethan froze. The name hit him right in the heart. He looked at her, eyes wide. She said you gave her hope, the woman added, smiling sadly. It felt right. Ethan swallowed hard, unable to find words. He nodded slowly, his voice breaking. Thank you for telling me. As he stepped out onto the quiet street, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the path ahead. He looked up, clutching the note to his chest. Somewhere deep inside, he felt it, that the woman's kindness, her courage, and her faith had left something behind, not just in that house, but in him too. And as he walked away, the wind carried the faint sound of a chime behind him, gentle, clear, and full of life, like Clara's voice whispering one last time, You saved me more than you know. The days that followed changed everything for Ethan. The world around him felt the same. People rushing, phones ringing, trains rattling, but inside him, something had shifted. The note from Clara's mother, the story of her final day, and the truth behind her soft smile haunted him in quiet moments. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still see her on the train, her hands gently resting on her stomach, her eyes full of both sorrow and peace. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had crossed paths with her for a reason. She had given him something intangible, an invisible responsibility he didn't quite understand yet. One evening, a soft rain began to fall as Ethan returned from work. The air smelled of wet earth and the city lights shimmered against the puddles. He decided to stop by Willow Street again. He didn't plan it, it just felt right. When he arrived at the small white house, he noticed a light glowing through the curtains. He hesitated, then gently knocked. Clara's mother opened the door and smiled softly as if she had been expecting him. Ethan, she said, come in. I was hoping you'd visit again. Inside, the house felt warmer this time. The air carried the scent of chamomile tea, and on the table sat a small photo frame. Clara's baby, wrapped in a pink blanket, sleeping peacefully. Ethan stopped, breath catching. She's beautiful, he whispered. The old woman nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. Her name is Hope. My daughter wanted her to grow up knowing that kindness exists in the world. Ethan's throat tightened. He couldn't look away from the photo. She will, he said quietly, because she already has proof. The old woman looked at him kindly. You gave that proof, Ethan. Clara saw something in you that she hadn't seen in years. Selfless humanity. She said people had become too cold, too busy to care. But you reminded her that goodness still breathes. Ethan didn't know what to say. He stared at the photograph again, the tiny baby's fingers curled into fists, her expression calm and innocent. She'll never know her mother, he murmured. The old woman smiled faintly. Maybe not in person, but through you she will. Clara wanted you to promise something. She reached into a drawer and pulled out another small envelope, yellowed at the edges. She wrote this before she boarded that train. Ethan took it carefully, his fingers trembling. Inside was a single page, folded twice. He unfolded it slowly and began to read. If my daughter lives, tell her this. The man who gave me his seat once carried her mother when no one else would. Tell her that real strength isn't in power, but in kindness. Let her grow up knowing that even in a crowded world, one gentle act can change everything. Ethan's eyes blurred with tears. He pressed the note to his chest, unable to speak. I don't deserve this, he whispered. You do, the woman said softly. Because you didn't act to be seen, you acted because it was right. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain against the windows. Finally, Clara's mother stood and said, Would you like to hold her? Ethan froze. Me? She nodded. Yes, I think she should meet the man who gave her mother peace. A few moments later, she returned with the baby in her arms. She was small, fragile, and perfect. When Ethan took her, he felt something shift inside him. A warmth, a weight, a quiet connection he couldn't explain. The baby opened her eyes just slightly and made a soft sound, and Ethan smiled through his tears. He whispered, "Hi there, Hope. Your mom was the bravest person I ever met." The old woman placed a hand on his shoulder. "You gave her strength. Now you've given Hope something too." Ethan looked down at the baby, her tiny heartbeat against his chest, and realized what Clara's final words truly meant. "You saved me more than you know." She hadn't just meant herself, she had meant her child. That night, when Ethan left, the rain had stopped and the sky was clear. The moon shone over Willow Street, and for the first time he felt light. He walked home quietly, the world around him seeming softer, brighter. He now understood that kindness doesn't end with one act, it keeps moving. Like ripples in water, touching lives you'll never even see. And somewhere, in that small white house, a baby named Hope slept peacefully, surrounded by love born from one simple, selfless decision on a crowded train. Days turned into weeks, but the memory of that moment never left Ethan's mind. Every time he rode the train again, he found himself looking at the same seat, the one he'd given up without thinking. It was empty most days, but to him it carried a quiet meaning. That seat wasn't just a place to rest anymore. It was a reminder of how one simple act could ripple through countless lives. The world around him kept moving, rushing, shouting, chasing things that didn't last. But Ethan had changed. He no longer looked at strangers the same way. Every face seemed to hold a hidden story. Every weary pair of eyes might be carrying silent battles. He had learned that sometimes the smallest kindness is the only light someone sees that day. One chilly morning, Ethan received a letter in his office mail. There was no return address, only a neat handwriting that looked oddly familiar. He opened it, and inside was a short note written in elegant ink. "She's growing well. She smiles when she hears music. Her favorite lullaby is the sound of the train." CM, he froze, his heart racing. It was from Clara's mother. He smiled faintly as he reread the note. He could almost hear the soft chime from the porch of her little white house on Willow Street. He folded the paper gently and slipped it into his wallet, next to Clara's original message. That night, Ethan returned to the train station. It was late, quiet enough that the sound of footsteps echoed through the platform. The city lights shimmered in the puddles from the afternoon rain. He sat on one of the benches, watching the trains come and go. People rushing in and out, faces tired, eyes distant. He thought about how many times he had been part of that same blur, moving through life without really seeing anyone. Clara's face flashed in his memory, the way she had smiled despite her pain, the way she had whispered those words, "You saved me more than you know." As he sat there, lost in thought, an old man walked by carrying heavy bags. Without hesitation, Ethan stood up and helped him. The man thanked him with surprise, saying, "No one ever stops to help anymore." Ethan smiled softly. "Someone once did that for me," he replied. The old man nodded and went on his way, leaving Ethan standing there with a faint warmth in his chest. He realized that kindness wasn't supposed to end. It was meant to pass forward, like a torch lighting another flame. When he finally boarded the late-night train home, he found himself seated beside a young woman holding a small baby wrapped in a pink blanket. She looked tired, her eyes half closed as she gently rocked her child. The baby stirred and let out a small cry. The woman smiled nervously and whispered, "Sorry." Ethan looked closer. The baby had soft brown curls and familiar blue eyes. His heart skipped. "What's her name?" he asked softly. "Hope," the woman replied, smiling faintly. "My mother said it was the name of someone special." Ethan felt his throat tighten. He smiled back. "It's a beautiful name," he whispered. As the train rumbled through the city, he couldn't help but glance at the reflection in the window, the woman, the baby, and himself sitting beside them. It felt like a quiet circle completing itself. The same train that had once carried loss and sorrow now carried new life, new beginnings and peace. When the train stopped at the next station, the woman stood up, holding the baby close. She turned to Ethan and said, "Thank you for giving up your spot." For a moment he was speechless. He didn't know how she knew, or if she even did. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe it was something deeper. Either way, his chest filled with warmth. Always, he said quietly. Always give up your spot when someone needs it more. She smiled, nodded, and stepped off the train. Ethan watched her disappear into the crowd, the sound of the closing doors echoing softly behind her. He leaned back against the seat, closing his eyes as the train moved again. For the first time in a long while, he felt peace, not the kind that comes from silence, but the kind that comes from knowing he'd made a difference. He didn't need fame, thanks, or recognition. The real reward was invisible, living in the heart of a baby who would grow up hearing stories about a stranger's kindness, and maybe one day passing that same kindness on. As the train rolled through the city lights, Ethan whispered to himself with a faint smile, "You saved me too, Clara." Outside the window, the stars shimmered faintly, and somewhere far away, a small wind chime on Willow Street swayed gently in the night air. The months that followed passed quietly, but they left traces of change in ways Ethan could feel deep inside. Life didn't rush him anymore. He had learned to slow down, to see people, not just pass them. Every morning he greeted the same coffee vendor, helped strangers with heavy bags, smiled at the old guard outside his building. None of it felt like effort anymore. Kindness had become his habit, like breathing. But one evening, as the sky turned orange and purple, something unusual happened. Ethan was at home, sorting through some mail when he found a cream-colored envelope with no return address. The handwriting on it was neat and delicate, the same he had seen once before, Clara's mother's handwriting. He opened it carefully. Inside was a letter and a photograph. The picture showed a small girl, barely a year old, sitting in a park, smiling at the camera. Her hair was brown and curly, her tiny hand clutching a silver heart-shaped locket. At the bottom of the photo, written in neat cursive, were the words, "Hope's first birthday. She loves trains." Ethan smiled faintly, his throat tightening. He read the letter that came with it. "Dear Ethan, Hope has started walking. She points at trains and claps whenever she hears one. I tell her stories about her mother, about how brave she was, and about the man who reminded her that kindness still exists. You gave my daughter peace, and through you, Hope has a future. CM." He stared at the words for a long time. The city outside his window seemed distant, muted. He placed the photo on his table next to Clara's old note and whispered, "She made it." That night, he took a walk to the same station where it had all begun. The platforms were quiet, the air cool, and the familiar hum of the rails vibrated faintly under his shoes. He sat on the same bench where he had first seen Clara. Everything looked the same, except him. As he sat there, he noticed a teenage boy struggling to help his grandmother up the stairs. Without hesitation, Ethan rose and helped them carry the heavy bag. The old woman thanked him softly, and the boy smiled shyly. "You didn't have to," the boy said. Ethan smiled back. "That's exactly why I did." He watched them disappear into the crowd, his chest filled with quiet peace. It struck him then, kindness doesn't need recognition. It only needs motion, like the trains that never stop moving, carrying lives and stories across endless tracks. The wind picked up, brushing against his face, and he thought of Clara again. Her calm smile, her tired eyes, the way she had said, "You remind me of someone." Maybe she had meant that he reminded her of the person she once hoped the world could still hold, someone who didn't ignore pain, who stopped to help, even when no one else did. He took the folded photo of baby Hope from his pocket and looked at it under the soft glow of the station lights. "You'll grow up strong," he murmured, "because your mother was stronger than anyone I've ever known." Then as the next train arrived, he stood up and boarded. The rhythmic sound of the tracks beneath his feet seemed to echo a message only he could hear, a heartbeat of the world that whispered back to him, "Keep going. Keep giving. Keep believing." Ethan didn't know where that train was headed, and for once he didn't care, because this time it wasn't about the destination. It was about continuing a journey that started with a single act of kindness on a crowded train. And as the city lights blurred past his window, he smiled quietly, realizing that somewhere out there, Clara's daughter was growing up in a world that was a little softer, a little kinder, all because one day a stranger had chosen to stand up. The story of Ethan and Clara didn't fade away. It lived quietly like an echo that never stopped repeating. Months had turned into a year, and life had moved forward. But something about that one day on the train continued to ripple through lives far beyond what Ethan could see. The story began spreading online after a local journalist wrote about it. Man gives up seat on train, unknowingly changes 2 lives. The article included a picture of Clara's mother and baby Hope, smiling together under the shade of a tree on Willow Street. The story touched millions. Strangers from across the world commented, sharing their own moments of kindness, their own stories of small miracles born from empathy. Ethan hadn't wanted attention, but kindness has a way of shining through even when you try to hide it. People started calling him the man who stood up. He didn't like the name, he thought what he did was nothing extraordinary, but he understood what it meant. In a world where everyone was too busy to look up, one person standing up meant something. One morning, as he rode the same train again, he saw something that made him smile. A young boy offered his seat to an elderly woman, and the passengers clapped softly. The boy grinned shyly, and Ethan's eyes filled with quiet pride. That's how kindness worked. It multiplied. Later that week, Ethan received another letter from Clara's mother. This one was shorter, written in her familiar, delicate handwriting. Hope has started school. She loves trains, and every night she asks me to tell her the story of the man who helped Mommy. She calls you Uncle Ethan. Ethan sat in silence after reading it, tears welling in his eyes. He imagined Hope, small and bright-eyed, listening to the story that had once been his quiet heartbreak, now turned into a bedtime tale of goodness and courage. He decided to visit again. When he reached Willow Street, he found the same wind chime by the door, still dancing softly in the breeze. When Clara's mother opened the door, Hope came running out, clutching a toy train. "Uncle Ethan," she shouted, wrapping her tiny arms around his legs. He froze for a moment, his heart swelling. He knelt down, smiling, his voice trembling. "You remember me?" She nodded eagerly. "Grandma tells me you're the reason Mommy smiled." Those words shattered and healed him all at once. He hugged her gently, whispering, "Your Mommy was the reason I smile." They spent the afternoon together, laughing, playing, sharing stories. The house that once carried sadness now echoed with warmth. Hope showed him her drawing, a picture of a woman, a train, and a man standing beside her. Above them she had written in big, uneven letters, "Kindness never dies." When Ethan left that evening, the sun was setting in golden light. The wind was soft, the street calm. He stopped once more at the end of the road and looked back at the house, the small white home with the sound of a wind chime and a little girl's laughter inside. He smiled quietly to himself, realizing something that made his chest ache in the best way, that his story wasn't his anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever chosen kindness when no one was watching. And as he walked away, the faint echo of a train horn in the distance reminded him of the day it all began. One moment, one gesture, one decision that proved a single act of compassion could outlive a lifetime. Somewhere, deep in his heart, he heard Clara's voice again, soft, warm, and eternal. "You saved me more than you know." And this time, Ethan smiled through his tears and whispered back, "You saved me too." Years later, the world had changed around Ethan, but the story still followed him like a quiet shadow, soft, meaningful, and eternal. The train lines had been modernized, the city louder and brighter, yet every time he saw a crowded carriage, he remembered that one summer afternoon, the woman with tired eyes, the folded note, and the words that had never stopped echoing inside him. He had grown older, his hair streaked with silver now, but his heart carried the same warmth. People often passed him by on the platform without knowing who he was. They didn't know that the man quietly holding his briefcase had once unknowingly altered the course of 3 lives, and that was exactly how Ethan wanted it. Kindness wasn't about being remembered. It was about continuing quietly, unseen but never forgotten. One morning, as he sat on a bench waiting for his train, a familiar sound filled the air. The giggle of a child. He looked up and froze. Running toward him was a little girl with curly brown hair, waving excitedly. "Uncle Ethan," she called out. Behind her walked a young woman in her 20s, tall, graceful, with the same soft smile Clara once had. Ethan stood slowly, heart racing. "Hope," he whispered. She laughed and nodded. "It's me. Grandma told me where you take your train. I wanted to see you." He smiled, his throat tightening as he looked at her. So full of life, a mirror of the mother she'd lost but never truly left behind. "You've grown," he said softly. Hope grinned. "I remember your letters," she said. "You used to tell Grandma that the world becomes better one act at a time. I try to do that too. I volunteer at the shelter now. Sometimes I even take the train just to help people who look lost." Ethan's eyes glistened. "You've done more than I ever did," he said quietly. She shook her head. "No, I just followed your example. Mom would be proud." They sat together on the bench as the city buzzed around them. Hope told him about her dreams, studying social work, helping single mothers, starting a small foundation called Clara's Seat. It was named after the moment that began it all. One man standing up so a tired woman could sit down. The foundation helped expectant mothers find safety, care, and dignity, turning one seat on a train into hundreds of places of refuge across the country. Ethan listened in silence, his heart full. He realized then that the story hadn't ended with him. It had grown, transformed, and taken on new life through the very child who had been saved that day. When the train finally arrived, Hope stood and said, "I have to go, but I wanted you to have this." She handed him a small silver heart-shaped locket, the same one Clara had worn. Inside was a tiny photo of Clara and baby Hope, and beside it, a note in her mother's handwriting. "For the man who stood up when the world sat down." Ethan held the locket tightly, unable to speak. "Thank you," he finally whispered, his voice trembling. Hope smiled, her eyes shining. "Thank you, Uncle Ethan. You didn't just give up your seat that day. You gave us a story worth living." As she boarded the train and waved goodbye, Ethan sat back down, watching her reflection disappear behind the glass. He felt a deep, wordless peace, the kind that comes only once in a lifetime. The train pulled away, the sound fading into the distance, but the message stayed behind like a heartbeat in the air. One small act of kindness can echo through generations. And as the sun rose above the tracks, Ethan closed his eyes, hearing once more that soft, familiar voice from years ago, Clara's voice. Calm and grateful, "You saved me more than you know." This time, he smiled and whispered back, "No, Clara, you saved all of us."